Welcome to The Better Part. Today we will be chatting with a poet from the University of Santa Clara who writes poems for adults, teenagers, children. He writes to the people, poems that you can understand. So please stay tuned.
Welcome to The Better Part, a program that encompasses a diverse spectrum of topics important to our community, which we hope will both inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy the program.
Today we have with us Tim J. Myers from the University of Santa Clara, a prolific writer and a poet, and we're going to be talking about poetry today. But before I let Tim say any words, I'd like to quote from one of his poems. It's a poem, it's called A Poet at 25, and I just lifted this line out because it kind of tells what it's all about. Alone with only words to carry his truth. That's kind of a motto for poets, I guess.
That's a great point, Phil. It is. It's funny to think about, we all deal with how do we live our lives, how do we express ourselves, how do we get along with other people, how do we find what we want to do in the world. And it's amazing how much of that comes down to language, and the language that we can find in ourselves to tell people who we are and to understand ourselves, the language that we even use to ourselves. And that line is really about that. We are in some ways alone except for our language. Obviously there are other ways that humans can communicate, but without that ability to really find yourself through language, you really can't be as full a human being as it's possible to be. So I really appreciate that you picked that line. I think that does sum up a lot of what poetry is about. And again, I want to emphasize it's not just poetry for people who write poetry. There's a certain deeper form of poetry, a more common kind, which is choosing the right words to express something important, some important meaning. So thank you for that.
As I was getting ready for this show, and I've thought of it before, you're an artist and you paint with words, and your palette is a dictionary.
That's absolutely right. In fact, one of the things you find about poets is they actually, if somebody comes to me and says, well, I might like to be a poet, one of the questions I'll ask them is, well, and actually some other poet said this at one point, how do you feel about words? How do you feel about sentences? And if somebody says to me, what do you mean, how do I feel about words? That person might not be a poet, because you're exactly right. The words are absolutely the poet's palette. And it's kind of, you see in young poets sometimes, or inexperienced poets, they get a little drunk on words. And they'll use words not as effectively as they can, but it's a good thing because the color or force of the word is so strong in them that they just want to use it. You often see young American poets spell gray in the English way, G-R-E-Y. And they do that partly, I think personally that's not a good thing to do. If you're American, you should own your Americanness.
Right.
But they love the word and they love the look of that E. Again, they're kind of drunk on words, and that's a powerful thing. That's a very good comparison, actually.
When you write a poem, it's kind of like a painting. Is it ever done?
There's this famous line from the French poet Paul Valéry. He says, "A poem is never finished; it is simply abandoned."
Oh.
And anybody who's ever written a term paper probably understands that at a certain point. You're like, I can't do any more with this. I actually, though, do feel that sometimes a poem is finished. But even then, for example, if I get a book of poetry accepted, or when I have, that hasn't happened that often, or I get a poem accepted, the editors have to be careful because poets are constantly tinkering again with it. Mm-hmm. So there is that tendency that it's like, oh, this could be. But there has to be an end point. And sometimes I feel satisfied. And that's a really, really good feeling where I don't want to change anything.
What does an editor do to a poem? I can see writing a book and they say, no, this phrase is wrong and this is not right. You can't change the words in a poem.
You can actually, and I've been on both sides of this situation. So I've edited some people's poetry. I just edited a book of poems by I think he's an 84-year-old priest, a monk. Mm-hmm. And so he wanted an editor. And he said, be harsh with me, be tough with me. So I'd say, I'm not sure if this part is as clear as it could be. And of course, what poets are talking about all the time is this word suggests X. Did you maybe mean to suggest Y, mm-hmm. or X and Y, or maybe X, Y, and Z? Mm-hmm. You'll see on Emily Dickinson, in some of Emily Dickinson's manuscripts, you'll see where she's written a line and there's a word crossed out, and then there's another word in the column crossed out, another word crossed out.
Yeah,
She'll go
what I mean.
10 deep.
Yeah.
10 deep sometimes, and this happens to poets.
Because you're shaping.
You're shaping, right.
Okay.
And the flavor of that particular word, the force, the meaning, all the rest of it is is critical. Nobody would, I mean, again, I like your artistic palette, for a painter comparison. It's also true about music. If you're a guitarist and you're doing a big solo or an improv in a song, you care about every note, how it falls in relation to all the other notes. This is kind of the nerdy, super fun part of poetry that poets love, which is really getting into that kind of thing, because they are our colors, like you say.
Well, talking about finishing your poems, let's hear one of your
that's a great
poems that
idea.
you have finished.
That's a great idea. My first book of poetry is That Mass at Which the Tongue is Celebrant, from a wonderful press called Pecan Grove Press in San Antonio. And I'll read a poem called He Considers the Profession. It's a poet talking about writing poetry. The profession is slightly comical in my mind, because nobody, or almost nobody, makes any money writing poetry. And this is about that, about this, what I mentioned earlier is there's this, it's more than an impulse and less than a compulsion in the negative sense, but there's an obsession, a beautiful, loving obsession with poetry that poets have. So he considers the profession. Here it is, the page again, empty, white, and new. My life is going nowhere, but there's something I must do. You can fight teen sex with lectures. You can build a seawall strong. You can douse the poet with poverty to cleanse him of his song. But song itself, invincible and cheerful, finds a throat. And though you make him miserable, the poet is the notes.
So how do you come up with a poem? Do you have like 1,000 poems that you're tinkering with, and then find ones that will work or fit in a
I think that
book?
does happen. I think you're always doing that throw a bunch of things against the wall and see what sticks kind of approach. Most of the time, though, the beginning of most, I hear a lot of poets talk about this. I'm not the only one. And I'm sure there are a lot of different ways of writing poetry for different people. But it often, for me, this is in contrast to other writing I do, it often more intensely starts with some kind of impulse. And often that impulse is very incoherent. It's felt rather than understood. So there'll be an image, and or something, I heard something happen, or sometimes it's a couple of words together or a line. For example, it fell out of the sun. So what does that mean? In fact, right now, that's kind of appealing to me. It fell out of the sun. What is that about? What could that be? So often it's a very powerful but very vague and unshaped feeling that you have that leads to poems. Now, sometimes I actually say, I want to write a poem about this, and it comes out more, I'm thinking about it more specifically. But a lot of times, even that has to come from somewhere where it's a deep impulse. And I guess that's the word I'd use more than anything else. And of course, you bring all kinds of things together when you actually write it. Your experience, what you've read, what you've known, people, what you think, all that kind of thing. But they tend to start in very interesting, unformed ways. And again, I didn't emphasize enough before, sometimes a phrase or even a word. So recently the word torment, I heard the word torment somewhere. And I was thinking, just like what we said earlier, I was thinking, torment, what an astonishing word that is. It's more than suffering. And it has this sense of, torment is also spiritual or mental suffering. I mean, it can just be physical torture, but tor, and it's that sense of turning or drilling into. There's something about the feel of the word. That kind of thing can often actually lead to a poem itself.
Super. How did you get started in your world of words? I mean, your whole life is words.
It's amazing how true that is.
How early on did you start with your words?
And this is really interesting to me, and I've told this story many times. I was a bit of a screw-off as an early elementary kid. I got an F in understanding what's read in second grade, which my wife, the PhD reading specialist, also at Santa Clara University, just blanches at. And I wasn't, my house was not a house full of readers or books. When I was in 6th grade, my teacher, Sister Mary Boniface at my Catholic school, gave us an assignment. We were to write an essay, or I don't think we call it an essay, but we were to write a piece. And for some reason, Phil, which I still do not understand, out of the blue, I decided to write a poem. The next day, when we turned them in, she said, all right, everyone, you boys and girls, you can go out to recess. Tim, I need to talk to you. And I was just petrified. And of course, what leapt into my mind is, I didn't follow directions. And I stood there, and she said, well, you know that poem you wrote? And again, I was waiting just for the boom to be lowered on me. She said, well, I liked it. And to this day, I still feel the astonishment of that moment. She, that wonderful woman, whom we thought originally was kind of a mean teacher because she was kind of quiet. I think now she was probably an introvert. Well, we had some lively nuns, believe me. She encouraged me and helped me bind some of my poems together in little binders. She opened this world to me, and it happened just that fast. And I just am so grateful to her for that. I don't know. And of course, I've been a teacher now for years, and I've been a teacher educator for years. I understand what teachers can do in those moments, but to me, it's nothing short of sacred what she did for me, because she let all this out. And I've been writing poetry ever since.
And it's interesting that the teachers that, just you remember, they lit the flame for something.
Lit the flame.
And either as, I think back, and I got a couple of them that saved me from getting in trouble also.
Yeah, which is another way of lighting the flame, right? Sometimes it has its prevention of negative, and sometimes it's, not proposing, but helping the positive. But that there's something about that. This links to me very deeply to what the nature of poetry is, because it's so many people think of it as, oh, poetry, it's about flowers and bees, or it's super obscure, as you mentioned before, or it has nothing to do with me. Well, real poets look at poetry as coming straight out of themselves, straight out of their daily lives, straight out of all the things that they think about and want, not that they should do, but so here was a teacher who somehow was open to that at a time when teachers were very strict, and we were very regimented in those schools. There was not a lot of emphasis on creativity. Something in her found that in me, and I'll just never stop being grateful to her.
Can you now do another reading for us, please?
I would be happy to.
Thank you.
My latest book is one that I'm really proud of. This comes from BlazeVox Press. Jeffrey Geitz is the wonderful editor of this press. So my poem is called Dear Beast Loveliness, or the book, pardon me, Dear Beast Loveliness, Poems of the Body. So let me read one of the poems here. This is called For Nick. Nick is my son, who's now 32 going on 33, but this is about his birth. For Nick. 2 days, pardon me, I need to back up for a second because there are a couple of references here. I think most people will remember the Voyager spacecraft.
Yes.
Still out there, by the way, amazingly. And we had gone down to this is when it was first still within the planets of the solar system, and our local public library had a deal where you could go down and listen to the sounds being sent back from space. So that's what this first part's about. For Nick. 2 days after Voyager's robot sensors first gathered the music of Saturn, its toning cry where solar wind meets planetary bow shock, fired back to Earth across 1 billion miles. And we stood in the auditorium to hear over the big speakers its boom and crackle and bell-like moan. 2 days after, I stood by your mother and heard your birthday arrive. Fetal monitor transmitting to us from the depths of her body that muffled whooshing of your tiny heart. So tell me, Nick, which was more mysterious and which came from farther away?
I read that one, and that line, I heard your birthday arriving. That's a beautiful phrase.
I appreciate that. That's interesting. That I didn't think of that, because it actually was hearing, because I could hear the fetal monitor. I didn't think about how direct that was. Thank you, Phil.
Now,
poetic insight, sir.
Yeah, I'm getting good at this.
Yes.
Yeah. Before you finish with that book, I'm going to stop and talk about that book a little bit.
Sure.
Poems of the Body. It covers many areas.
So to
love,
speak.
sensuality, biology, relationship, partnering, Catholic boys, Einstein's brain, nuns, limbo, which we have determined doesn't exist anymore, and kicking a football.
Yes.
How do you put a collection like that together? The thread is body, right?
Yes, exactly.
And when I came to the part about the kid kicking the football, I said, this isn't like some of the other ones.
No, exactly. And in fact, one of the things that, I mean, there generally speaking, you have two types of poetry collections. I mean, obviously there are wrinkles on that, but you can have a looser collection with just a number of poems about various things, and you
Just
can have
an
one
author's type.
yeah, or you can have a themed collection like this. And I really wanted to write the theme collection. Although I have to say, I didn't set out to write a themed collection. What I did was look back in all the poetry I'd written, and I saw again and again there were poems that had something to do with the human body. And I want to emphasize again what this says about poetry. That feeling that poetry is something that's either academic or super literary, has nothing to do with real people. Well, holy cats, we all have bodies. You know, again, poets write, good poets write right out of the middle of life in all its glory and its struggle, its darkness, its brightness. And the body, of course, is, I mean, how much more basic can you get to who we are as human beings? So all of those things fit with that theme of the body. For example, the football poem is from my own direct experience as a high school football player, and I was the punter. And one of the things you got to do if you were the punter was to go off to the side and practice by yourself. And I can still feel that. The quiet joy of kicking a football the right way and feeling the motion of your body is what that poem is all about. And that's a tremendous gift. And one of the things I wanted to say in this book is about the astonishing gifts we're given with bodies. On the other hand, this book is also about disease and death and the other terrible things that can come through the body, the suffering.
And
the
Vietnam
rest
orphans.
of it. The Vietnam orphans, you know, that was, it's amazing how the body led to that. I mean, these are American servicemen under, and of course there were service women there too, but under horrific circumstances in a war where the moral reasoning was not clear, where there was all kinds of disagreement. Very young men, most of them, in a situation. I mean, wars tend to create these situations. So what I talk about is there was an alliance between foreign soldiers and local women, and it produced children who were, you know, it's been a long-standing problem. Children who seem to not have any place in either country. It's heartbreaking, really. I hope it's improved. I don't know enough about the whole situation.
Not to make fun of the word, but they were literally culturally in limbo.
Exactly. And in fact, it's not making fun of the word. That, by the way, I would have to say is a very poetic application of a word. So here's this Catholic Church concept of limbo for those that are neither this nor that. And then we have kids, and we use that phrase, in limbo, in that way, which is a very, when you think of it, it's a strange theological metaphor. So I was like, I don't know, am I supposed to be there now? Am I here? I'm in limbo. Oh, yeah.
Okay, we won't go into limbo anymore.
Right, okay.
Why don't you teach poetry and creative writing?
Well,
it is creative writing.
But think of you can imagine what it's like in an English department.
Right.
The place is lousy with creative writers. And some people have been hired to teach it. I have some wonderful colleagues, poets, novelists, you know, all the rest of it. So people are always fighting to see who gets to teach creative writing. So,
but you do teach it, right?
Well, I do. In fact, when I teach creative writing, I usually, so far, at this university, I've only taught creative writing for children and adolescents. So that's the creative writing course I've taught.
Oh, I see. Well,
which sometimes includes poetry if the students want to.
It would, because that one book is written in rhyme.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So, and these are my children's books that are either about poetry or are written as poetry. And again, like as you emphasized at the beginning, I write for all ages, and I write poetry for all ages.
How well do children accept poetry and rhyme in their storybooks?
If you have ever seen kids on a playground, even today in our digital world where our kids are supposed to be so much more sophisticated, you'll hear poetry, right? John and Mary sitting in a tree, K-I-S-S-I-N-G. You know, all these jump rope rhymes, Miss Mary Mack, I mean, all of these things, it's amazing how these tend to flow through playground culture from generation to generation. There is a problem in the world of picture book writing that a lot of people try to write picture books in rhyme, and in rhyme and meter, and they don't do a very good job of it. So editors will sometimes say, No poetry in the picture books. But in fact, new picture books with poetry in them come out all the time. You just have to be able to do it well. But not only children are accepting of rhyme and meter in poetry, people who listen to rap and hip hop are very accepting of rhyme and poetry. In fact, one of the typical things that rappers use is assonance, where you do rhymes within lines. And the human ear loves rhythm and rhyme. It just loves it. Look at commercials, how many times they use it. People have sayings, what goes around comes around. It's not strictly poetic, but it has a rhetorical structure that has a rhythm that the ear loves and that the mind kind of gloms onto. So there's a great taste for it, not just interest in it. Human beings have a basic taste for it.
Okay. So let's get to another reading.
Sure. While we're talking about kids kids poetry, I thought I'd read one. My book, Dark Sparkle Tea, is a book of bedtime poems for children. As I say, it's a book for kids at bedtime don't want to go to bed and parents want them to go to sleep.
I remember that.
Yeah. So it's got crazy poems in it, energetic poems, and then quieter poems. So the idea is we kind of lull them in. But I want to read Bees at Night. One of the reasons I love writing for children is you can be much more openly interested in sounds. Not that adult poetry is all about sound too, but Bees at Night is definitely a sound poem. Bees at Night. When the dizzy, busy, buzzy bees come home to their hive at night, bee yawning beyond the fields where they waggle worked all day, they climb through the winding hidden hive to their cozy, dozy beds, and then, oh, not a biz of a buzz there is, not a wheeze or a sneeze, as bee dreams come of work to be done, of honey and sun. And the queen at the heart of the hive, she dreams of her thousands of daughters and sons. The June moon shines, the world is still, hollyhocks closed in their rows on the hill, and the dreaming bees are at ease as cool night breezes breeze. And oh, this pleases the bees, all blissful and buzzless in bed, as they lie with shut eyes like stars in the skies, bee dreams abuzz in their heads.
A lot of bees in that poem.
A lot of bees, thousands.
Thousands of real bees and literally bees.
Yes, yeah, literally bees. Much buzzing. The sound aspect of poetry is really, really important to me. I love the sound of poems. And so, in fact, the comparison you used before, that deft comparison of the artist's palette and the colors, in poetry it's even doubled. So a color is a color on a canvas. But a word is both a visual representation and a sound for poetry. So word choice that way is like you have this double thing going on all the time, which again is why I love a word like torment. Why it has such a power for me is partly the sound as well as the way it looks. And I love your point too about the New Yorker, to circle back to that, because there have been plenty of poems in the New Yorker that I've read that I have not been able to understand.
Oh, good.
Oh, sure. I could reach up on my shelf at home and find you a poem that you and I don't understand in under 30 seconds. Even the poem about my son Nick, if you haven't been a parent, that poem won't have the same emotional force for you.
Listening for his birthday.
Yeah, and what it means when a child comes into the world, it's, I just kind of lose my mind when I think about what the births of my children were like, and not only what it meant, but just what it felt like. So again, I think it's really worth pushing for some of these things. And of course, it's like anything else. The more you read, the better you get at it. So for example, my children's books about Basho, these two. Basho's an amazing poet whose work just thrills and chills me. He's not simple. Haiku, you have to understand a little more about it. A lot of times a haiku poem is more about implication than coming right out and saying something, so you have to learn to infer. So one of the reasons I wrote these books was to bring children into it by creating a story that children and adults, by the way, can understand, can be motivated by, and then that will carry them hopefully naturally and organically to some of the poetry and hopefully give them a taste for more. But I can't agree more with your point about fun. As a poet, one thing, I'd be delighted if people were teaching my poetry in classes, but I would be so upset if they were forcing it on students in a way that didn't help students understand it, if they were giving them to students who were too young to have the full context. It has to be something you actually want. Literature should not be a hammer to hit people over the head with. And there are plenty of ways to help adults and children get more involved in literature and therefore get more out of it.
Okay. Can you select the closing
I'd
poem
be happy
for
to.
us?
As I've said a number of times now, poetry comes straight out of life. Poetry is not, it's not some fancy pants thing. It's not some dry thing. This is a sad, very sad poem. It's about my own family. I have a sister who died of anorexia. She was 28 years old. This was years ago. It was a horrible tragedy in my family, the effects of which are still felt. So I'll read this poem, Anorexia. I don't think there's anything in here I need to explain or reference. Anorexia. My sister died when none of us were looking. She'd grown thin as a rake handle, leaf thin, cold as November wind, an autumn world withdrawing into its narrowing self. We were many and loud with desires, a big happy family, the envy of others. Played basketball in our parents' driveway, drank beer and talked long into the night, ate like farm animals. But she'd learned to hate food, to fear it. Slowly became a desperate, impoverished dictatorship sealing its own borders. She moved to Chicago, left teaching to become a flight attendant, loved us quietly from the distance her new appetite for suffering forced her to. From jet aisles where she served food to strangers, looking appropriately slender in her uniform. We loved the sun, met for family dinners, began producing grandchildren, went camping out under the bright, fertile stars. Forgive us. We didn't want to know how the planets were spinning out of their orbits, drifting, fragmenting, colliding there in her head.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Well, Tim, thank you for coming with us this morning. And we didn't get to half the stuff that I wanted to talk about.
No problem. We will never get even to the half of it, Phil. That's the beauty of it.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for watching. This has been a fun show this morning talking with Tim, and we really enjoyed it. We hope you go out and read a poem. That would be a fun thing to do. You can also find our programs on YouTube and in the Santa Clara County Library System. See you next week on The Better Part.